This is the BioCentury Show. Brought to you by the 24th Bioequity Europe, scheduled for May 2024 in San Sebastian, Spain. Join BioCentury EBD Group and Regional Host Committee Chair Isios Capital for biotech's premier CEO and investor conference in one of the culinary capitals of the world.
Hello, I'm Steve Usden, Washington editor of BioCentury. A lot of the most important controversies in the life sciences involve truth, finding scientific truths, sorting hope from hype, and increasingly debates over whether there is such a thing as truth. Other controversies center on autonomy. Who decides? For example, who should be able to decide whether a patient should be able to access a medicine? Who decides how much data a company must disclose and how much it can keep secret? So today, I'm going to talk with someone who thinks about these kinds of questions a lot, an ethicist, Arthur Caplan. He's the head of the Division of Medical Ethics at NYU Langone Medical Center. Art, it's interesting to me. Some things seem at the time to be harbingers of immense change, like cloning Dolly the sheep, and then they kind of fade away. And some events catch the public imagination, really are inflection points. You've been involved in a few of those, from Jesse Gelsinger's death in a gene therapy trial to the viral media campaign to get a 6-year-old boy named Josh Hardy access to an unapproved antiviral drug. I want to talk about that, about the impacts of the Josh Hardy case. It was 10 years ago in early March 2014. Can you recap really briefly what happened? Because I want to make sure we have time to actually focus on what changed as a result of that. But to start with, what happened?
Well, thanks for having me, Steve. The young boy, Josh, I believe shortly, maybe when he was 2 or 3, was diagnosed with a very rare form of kidney cancer. And people believed that it was very likely to kill him because they didn't really have any way to effectively treat it, short of removing his kidneys. He wouldn't survive even with dialysis. They were terrified of spread. But nonetheless, he was getting some treatments and was living on those standardized responses to kidney cancer. I believe he was in the state of Tennessee. Well, as part of his system being immunosuppressed, a cytomegalovirus began to grow in his body and attack, of all things, his kidneys. So his kidney function became even more imperiled than it was from his underlying disease. Everybody said there's no treatment for this virus, nothing we can do. But a few of the docs, by the time he had gotten, I believe, to St. Jude's Hospital, said, we have a company out there that is making an antiviral drug that could, since it's a wide spectrum antiviral, be helpful for this particular virus. However, still in clinical trials, not approved. The company was Chimerix. And they said, why don't you try to see to the mother if you could obtain that drug? And normally when you tell somebody that, they're not sure what to do, how to proceed. This woman was a whiz at getting things together. So long story short, she managed to reach out to the CEO of Chimerix, who was a guy named Ken Mock. He initially said, we're not giving this out for that condition. We're testing it for other viral diseases, but no interest in making it available to Josh. At that point, she said, oh yeah, and launched a gigantic PR campaign to save Josh. It was hashtag Save Josh, and she appeared all over the media, all over social media, got tens of thousands of letters of support. In fact, the first I found out about the case was when I got a phone call from Ken Mock, who was holed up in a motel somewhere saying, I'm getting death threats like once every 15 minutes. This woman is on my case. Now we've got the national media pressing to say, save Josh and give him the medicine. I'm not even sure it would work. I'm not even sure what dose to use or anything. I said, no, but what would your advice be about what to do?
And in the end, just to cut it short, because I did follow this very closely at the time, in the end, they found a way to get it to him. They started a new phase 3 trial, and he was the first patient in it. And remarkably, it actually helped him.
It did for a short time.
for 2 years, which
Yeah.
was quite a lot for him and for his family. The interesting thing to me, though, is that this sparked tremendous amount of change, right? One of the things that it sparked was a change in the way that companies, pharma companies and biotech companies, think about expanded access. And you were, or compassionate use as it's also called, and you were involved in that, right? You created a compassionate use advisory committee for J&J. Can you talk about that?
Well, the Josh Hardy case really opened my eyes to the challenge of early access to unapproved drugs. I hadn't really thought about that issue very much. There'd been one or two people in the past who sort of sought an unapproved drug. Usually they were celebrities or people with connections, government officials, and they managed to get the drug kind of under the table, without much publicity. Here we had a little kid who just, his mom happened to be good at drawing attention and being a very strong advocate for Josh, but it didn't seem fair. There were other people out there who needed perhaps to get early access to drugs. And so I began to talk to companies and say, what do you do? And big companies, I might add, not small startups, but big ones. And I said, what do you do? And they said, we don't give it out. We're not getting into that. It's a situation where we don't usually have much extra supply of drug, and it would put us in a position of having to ration, and we're not going there. And I thought about it, and in conversation with Johnson & Johnson, I said, are you not giving out any drugs, even ones that look good, say in phase 2B or early phase 3? They said, yep, we don't want to manage the requests, and we're tired of getting phone calls from former presidents and governors and whoever. We just wash our hands of it. And I said, but you could give it out. You have some to give away, right? Long story short, I said, how about this? Let's try an experiment, ethics experiment. I'll set up a committee, 10 people from around the world, bioethicists, doctors, and patient advocates. You tell me a drug that's promising, and they had one in phase 3 for multiple myeloma. We'll take the requests, we'll blind them so we don't have the problem of governors and celebrities trying to pull strings. We'll treat everybody fairly. And we'll make a recommendation based on criteria like likelihood to succeed or severity of illness or quality of life. And then you can decide who you want to give your limited supply to. That was the Compassionate Use Advisory Committee. And it worked. Just quickly, they had involved maybe, 250 people in their phase 3 clinical trial. By the time we got done giving advice and prioritizing requests, which came in from around the world, because all the oncologists knew about this drug that was doing so much better than existing treatments for multiple myeloma, I'll bet we gave out 500 doses to people, and we began to get feedback that it was working on them.
And those are 500 people who, before your committee was involved, before they decided to give it out on a compassionate use basis, probably wouldn't have gotten it because
They definitely wouldn't have gotten it.
It might have been too late for many of them. Yeah.
Trials were full, and for some of them, they wouldn't have even been eligible. They were further along with their disease than would have made them eligible for the J&J trial. So it was really people who couldn't get into trials who were looking for pathways.
And then J&J expanded that out, right? Your advisory committee still exists, and you're advising for a whole range of products that they're making available on a compassionate use basis.
Yeah, I think this turned out to be a very important event in the history of access to drugs for ill and desperate people who can't, for one reason or another, get into a clinical trial. J&J was very satisfied. They were initially kind of wary, and their lawyers, we don't have enough time to tell you all the worries and objections they had, but eventually they calmed down. We said, we're blinded, we'll be fair. Even if people say that we're a death committee or we're rationing, we're going to say we're going to get more drug out to people by having the committee than not. And that turned out to be absolutely true. So J&J liked it, expanded it to other drugs in their pipeline that were phase 3 primarily, but not finished. Then other companies began to knock at my door and say, we want to mimic that. We'd like to do what you're doing. And they sometimes asked us to set up a committee. Sometimes they did it internally with their own folks and set up their own internal committees. And so that model has spread very widely.
So I think a lot of people looking at this, and maybe even some of the ones in the companies looking at this, would say, That's great. These big companies have the resources and they have the energy to do it. Maybe it's great, maybe it's not. Wouldn't it be better if there was a government entity or some kind of outside entity that didn't have any kind of financial stake in the outcomes of these decisions providing this advice?
It's a great point because I got permission from J&J to publish a little bit on the compact, and we have a variety of articles and presentations. And one of the suggestions I make is, this is a private entity set up by me. People say, who's on the committee? It's like people I knew or I asked, and they said they were willing. Who set up the rules? The committee, private entity. Why aren't governments doing it? And I can tell you, at least in the US, politically just too controversial.
Maybe a death panel.
No government official wants to go back to those death panel charges. They're afraid to ration. They don't want to admit it. They love jumping up and saying, Pfizer, J&J, Amgen, Biogen, you have to give this drug to my constituent. They love that role. They hate the role of saying, well, what if there are 10 constituents and enough for 3?
Wow. And what if you're a small company? What if you're a company that, because a lot of these very promising drugs are discovered and brought to approval by very small companies, likely they can't afford to even think about these issues, and certainly can't afford to set up a whole advisory committee to handle these kinds of requests.
So the startups, the small guys, the other difference is most of them are in phase 1 or 2. So they will get bought or partner or sometimes do other things that bring them into the ambit of larger places. But they do get requests. I've seen requests for animal study drugs, stuff that's still in animal trials going to a company. We try to advise them and help them. I've sometimes suggested setting up a consortium of the small guys with a common committee. That has not happened yet, but I think it's a good idea. We also told and advised them, you must put on your websites what your policies are. Don't leave people guessing. Don't leave them flounder. If you can't do it, you can't afford it, or in some cases you don't have enough drug to even get to phase 3 without some success at phase 1 and 2. Put that on your website. Tell people, here's the contact. We're not doing this yet, but let us, we hope our drug works out. And if it turns out to start to be successful at phase 3, we'll let you know, follow the website.
And it's not just you advising them to do that. As a result, I think of the publicity from Josh Hardy, Congress included in the 21st Century Cures Act a requirement that companies do that.
Right. We push that through. So our compact basically said, if you can't do it, you ought to be required to be transparent with desperate patients, and it became the law.
But the problem is that law didn't include any kind of enforcement mechanism, and it hasn't been adopted by anything like all of the companies that have products.
And well, Congress was quick to say, I love that website idea. And we're not quick to say, hey, let's create a fund to help people pay if the little company can't. So there's no money around to reimburse somebody who's desperately hunting. That becomes crowdsourcing.
Yeah. All right. So taking a step back, you said Ken Mock called you up from the hotel when he was besieged. I'm wondering, CEOs of biotech and pharma companies, they receive training on all kinds of things, including how to be better communicators, but they don't typically get training on ethics issues, I think. Maybe you've got a vested interest in saying yes, because that's what you do. but do you think that that as a routine matter, senior management of companies that are developing these drugs that have such a profound effect on people's lives should have training in ethics and these kinds of issues?
I do. I think it's important, if you're going to manage a small or a big company, that you understand issues around the ethics of recruiting subjects, that you could give advice if someone comes and says, I don't know how to shut down this trial, it's not working, or there's a competitor that's doing better, how do we back out of this? Now, they have lawyers and experts to aid them, but it's very important that leadership know where to direct people and sometimes weigh in on particular cases. The other thing I think is important is that it extends to investors. What I kept seeing with Josh Hardy and some of the cases in its wake is it wasn't the company that decided, it was the board or sometimes their investment people who made the decisions, and they weren't acquainted at all with sort of the ethics and regulation of the area.
Great. Well, thanks, Art. We're going to have to take a break now. And when we come back, we're going to talk about some other issues. In particular, I want to get your views on some of the issues around an upcoming decision that FDA is going to make about an accelerated approval or converting an accelerated approval for gene therapy for Duchenne muscular dystrophy to a full approval. We'll be right back.
For more than 20 years, BioEquity Europe has been where CEOs and investors gather to network, partner, and debate critical issues facing the biotech industry. In 2024, BioEquity heads to San Sebastian, Spain, in Basque Country, May 12th to 14th. Join BioCentury, EBD Group, and Regional Host Committee Chair Isios Capital in one of the world's culinary capitals for a destination event designed for CEOs, investors, and decision makers across the global biopharma ecosystem. In 2023, 300 VCs and 330 biotech CEOs joined BioEquity in Dublin, Ireland. In San Sebastian, the program will feature more than 100 emerging biotechs that will present their story to investors and potential partners. Don't wait, last year's BioEquity conference sold out. Visit bioequityeurope.com for more information.
I'm back with Art Caplan. Art, FDA is considering whether it should convert Sarepta's accelerated approval for a gene therapy for Duchenne muscular dystrophy to a full approval. I think you're familiar with it, despite the fact that the confirmatory trial missed the primary endpoint and the fact that anyone who receives this therapy may not be able to receive another gene therapy, and there are other gene therapies that are in the pipeline. Despite that, CBER Director Peter Marks has signaled that he's pretty likely to grant full approval. In a public webinar, he acknowledged in response to a question that I posed that there are uncertainties about this, especially associated with the fact that these kids aren't going to be able to get other therapies if they've gotten this one, other gene therapies. And he said, really, this isn't a decision for FDA. It's a decision for parents and families. He said, this is a quote, this is a place where education of the patient and family are really critical because I can't make that choice. That's the end of the quote. What do you think about that? Can and should families decide something like that? Or is that really FDA's job?
I do think it's FDA's job to weigh in with more than just, well, the evidence is not great, but enough to put us into an approval. That's really not enough in terms of guiding what families and patients are going to be thinking about using it. I think, you've got to, in some ways, say, we've looked at the literature, here's what's persuasive, and we'll give that approval, but take into account you're going to be disqualified from future trials, maybe from future gene therapy efforts, because you're going to create resistance, if you will, to the first intervention like Sarepta. That's going to knock you out. Better things are coming. How far does the eligibility go in terms of how old you are, how much damage you have suffered from the disease? If you want to leave it to parents, my experience is then that means they're all going to use it. If they can get access, if somebody can do it, they'll do it. Most parents morally are going to say, I'm not going to sit around here and watch my kid get sick and die. So if the FDA gave an approval, I don't care. It was a weak approval, a non-enthusiastic approval. It's out there, let's get it. And once you have that, if you just say leave it to parents, well, they're not going to abandon their kids as they would see it. One other thing that might be done is they need help, the parents, maybe an advocate, somebody who could be independent and say, here's the way I think this through. You're not a bad parent if you don't do this right away. It's 9 months from now, something else is coming along, and maybe that will still be beneficial. Those parents need help, and they need independent advice beyond that they're going to get from the drug seller. So in a lot of situations, I'm a big proponent of, if you will, parent advocates. Somebody who doesn't care whether you use the drug, is not getting paid to make you use the drug, but can give you honest advice.
That's interesting. So I want to pivot to another question, which is also asking kind of about FDA's job. So FDA Commissioner Rob Califf has focused a lot on the problem of medical disinformation and misinformation. And he's emphasized how serious that is for the United States and for the world. Two questions for you. One, is solving that FDA's problem? And regardless of whose problem it is, how can it be solved? What can be done to address the rising tide of medical disinformation and misinformation, which has gotten even worse, has been accelerated as a result of the experience with the pandemic?
Well, on the first issue, keep in mind a local court in Texas faced with the decision about the availability of mifepristone the day after abortion pill, basically said, FDA, its review over whatever it is, 30 years since that drug has been around, it's not up to the task. We don't trust it. They ignored evidence. So we think that that approval should be overturned. And there's a parallel case out there, without going into the details, that says, you know what, these regulatory agencies, we shouldn't really be trusting them. All of these decisions about drug availability, for example, should be made by a judge. A judge.
Yeah, so we don't want an unelected FDA. We want an unelected judge. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
moreover, the evidence that the judge used to decide that FDA's review stunk is been retracted, and it's clearly all produced by pro-life scientists with a big dog in the fight about abortion. But my point here is, Steve, the FDA is under huge threat. Not just should they solve the disinformation problem, they're hanging on by their fingernails, to their authority to regulate the entire industry. People don't understand how serious the challenges are, and there's a large number of people in Congress who don't like the FDA and don't want it there at all. And they, by the way, are not being pressured that way by pharma or biotech. It's their hatred of the deep state. So can FDA solve misinformation? I hope FDA can keep itself alive, would be my answer to that. The second point, so what are we going to do? I think science is in deep trouble. Every day we hear about another retraction of a paper, a peer review problem, a fraud, an image manipulation. Peer review is clearly just broken down. That's the gold standard of how the science community determines truth, or the truth at any time as they can best determine it. If that's weak, it opens the door to all kinds of skepticism and doubt. People just point to it and say, can't trust those guys. They're retracting and they lie and they manipulate and they got conflicts. The first order of business of the science community should be to fix peer review, launch a national project to decide how to do that. If you don't have that in place, then you can't say this is good evidence. Beyond that, train people who are scientists, who are doctors, to be better communicators. Even in COVID, you could probably name 50 people who were spouting nonsense about COVID and vaccines and masks. I'll bet you can't name 5 who were trying to stick up for the science of masks and vaccines and isolation and so on. So the critics held their ground and almost overwhelmed the scientists community, their ability to speak. But where's the training? If I went and said to one of my friends over at NYU in the lab sciences, I'm going to take this guy, do a little communications training with him. Let's do it 4 days a week for a month. 4 times in a month, a day a week. They'd say, he's not leaving the lab. That's not important. That's not his job or her job. It is. It's public money. We're in a war. You got to train the troops up here. We don't have enough communicators.
Another issue that you've talked about and you've written about recently that also kind of gets to this whole issue of how do you determine what the truth is and who should decide who gets access to things is Neuralink. Give a little bit of background there. What's that about, and what are your concerns about it?
Well, Elon Musk, among his many innovations, whether he's tunneling from LA to San Francisco or going to Mars or building electric cars, he also has a project he's been funding generously, billions, called Neuralink. And basically what he wants to do is provide an interface from the human brain to a computer, maybe ultimately up in the cloud. Short term, what he says is we could really use a brain implant, not just an electrode, but an actual chip in the brain to communicate with people who are paralyzed or blind, maybe help them move things, help their eyes to see. Well, that's all great. The bad news is he is not transparent in the least. So you've got desperate people. I mean, if I asked the community of people who are blind, would you like to be in a study that would let you see again? I think I'd get a pretty high enrollment. And that's kind of what he does, whereas all they can do is 1 or 2 people at a time right now, and they have no idea whether it's going to work or not. Musk has been conflicted in that he's got a huge stake in letting this brain technology move fast. All he does is tweet a little bit, say, we put one in, things are good. You open up the human brain and stick a chip in there, I'm going to say press release journalism is not sufficient to tell us what they're doing, how they protect the interests of the subject, how they found them, what would they do if it failed, how could they get it out, and many other questions. So commercial press release journalism for a huge scientific advance, which I'm not opposed to in principle, but this is not the way to proceed. And I worry that there's more of this to come in the future as science goes more commercial.
And what's interesting here is that it's not illegal, right? With a drug, it would be if somebody put a drug into somebody and then send out all they did was send out a tweet and said they got it and look, it's doing great, they'd be in a world of trouble. But with a medical device, that isn't the case.
Correct. The medical device regs do not require animal testing. They don't even require sort of organized setup of a trial into phase 1. You can use them with a lot more liberty. You know, even in the Musk trial, there were allegations that they had trouble with this chip model in monkeys, but no one knows what the trouble was, and no one knows whether it's likely to reoccur in humans. But they apparently had paralysis and epileptic type fits and stuff in the animals. It's alleged. I myself don't know because I've heard it from others who say they know. So again, to move major innovations forward, let's demand more transparency. Let's make sure we can all see what's going on, that the science is legit, it's the right time to try it, and that they're doing it in a way that's protective of the subjects when they have these big financial interests, personal financial interests.
And so that probably would require Congress to act, right? Because FDA doesn't have the authority to require it now, and it's clear that that some of the companies that are doing it are not going to voluntarily adhere to those kind of standards.
Right. And the other thing that might be done is institutions could say, we're not working with you unless you follow the expected standards for drug development. They could, because I don't know who his partners are.
One more topic, not to be controversial at all. You talked about the injectables for obesity, and you're kind of the skunk at the garden party. I think you're the only person I've heard say anything negative about them, except for the fact that people who want them can't get them, or people who get them think that they're too expensive. But you've got some other thoughts about them.
Yeah, so I'm not anti the injectables, but we got to be careful here. We, for example, don't know what the long-term impact would be of these injectables if they all turn out to have adverse events. Anybody remember fen-phen? In 5 years, that's trouble. So people need to be warned that this isn't just a complete magic bullet, because we don't know. You're going to use it in kids. It's not indicated for that, but off-label. I can already find things online that'll get these injectables to you, and you could give them to your kid if your doctor, whoever that might be, will go along. We've got direct-to-consumer models coming from places like Lilly, where they're going to cut out the pharmacist and just say, hey, we got a partnership with telemedicine doctors. Let us know if you want this drug. We'll get it to you. We've seen what that looks like when you come to things like Viagra and Cialis. I don't know where the doctors are, and they don't really ask you what the underlying problem is. But I'll end by saying the biggest challenge to me is, do you want to live in a world where you take an injectable once a week from, the rest of your life? Or do we still want to say, and you got to keep working on your lifestyle, and we also have to try and produce food that is less caloric, less bad for your health? I mean, I'd hope we do both at the same time. I worry that the marketing is just going to say, hey, here's some good news. Want to eat more candy? I got the injectable.
Well, and to take the other side of it, people have been trying, they've been trying behavioral interventions, they've been trying population health interventions for a long time, and none of those have worked. This does seem to work.
I still would argue you can't give up. I don't think we want a world in which we adjust ourselves to the current food supply, high calorie, particularly for poor people, and saying, stay sedentary, and eat anything. That messaging still, I think, we have to do our best.
Great. Well, thanks, Art. We've kind of run out of time for today, but thanks. I'm glad that we had a chance to talk. I'm glad to find an ethicist who is such a shrinking violet and afraid to say what you really mean out here in public. And I hope we can do it again.
No two-handed ethicist on the one hand, on the other here. Thank you for having me.
Brought to you by the 24th Bioequity Europe, scheduled for May 2024 in San Sebastian, Spain. Join BioCentury EBD Group and Regional Host Committee Chair Iseos Capital for biotech's premier CEO and investor conference in one of the culinary capitals of the world.